Picture the human race, laid out on a timeline. For almost 200,000 years, we are hunter-gatherers, living and dying by the rhythm of the seasons. Our greatest technology is a sharpened stone. Then in an instant, a geological blink of an eye around 6,000 years ago, everything changes. Suddenly we have astronomy, agriculture, metallurgy, written language, and kingship. We build monumental cities out of nothing in the Mesopotamian dust. Mainstream history calls this a revolution, a natural, spontaneous explosion of human genius. Except that's not what the people who lived it said happened. They wrote with painstaking precision that all of it was given to them, that they were taught, that they were governed by beings who were not human, who came from the sky and who eventually left them behind. We look at our own staggering progress and see a species reaching for the stars. But what if our oldest records are telling us we were a project that was simply abandoned? This isn't just a mythological curiosity. This is the story of our own creation told by the ones who were there. And if you're using this video to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly what it's for. So maybe hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely love checking those. It's wild seeing London at sunrise, New York at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching at the same time. Tonight we are going to explore a terrifying and profound possibility. Not as a myth, but as a historical event. We will journey back to the dawn of civilization, to the land of Sumer, and read their stories, not as allegories, but as technical records. We'll examine the beings they called the Anunnaki, the gods who descended from the heavens. We will investigate the purpose for which humanity was supposedly created. And then we will confront the central mystery. Why, around 4000 BCE, did they leave? What happened that caused our creators to sever ties, to walk away from their grand experiment? Was it because we had failed them? Or was it, perhaps far more chillingly, because we had finally succeeded in a way they never intended? To understand the abandonment, you first have to understand the mission. The story doesn't begin on Earth. It begins out there, in the cold, dark expanse of the solar system, on a planet our histories have forgotten. The Sumerian tablets, the oldest written texts on Earth, speak of a 12th planet in our solar system. A rogue world caught in a vast 3,600-year elliptical orbit that brings it swinging between Mars and Jupiter before flinging it back out into the abyss. They called it Nibiru, the planet of the crossing, and according to those same texts, Nibiru was dying. Its atmosphere was failing, bleeding heat and life out into the void. Its inhabitants, a technologically advanced and long-lived race we would come to know as the Anunnaki, faced extinction. Their scientists devised a desperate, last-ditch solution: to seed their upper atmosphere with a fine mist of monatomic gold particles, creating a reflective shield to heal their world. It was a staggering feat of planetary engineering, but it required one thing they did not have: a massive, almost incomprehensible quantity of gold. Their search brought them here, to Earth, a small, wet, insignificant world in their eyes, but one that was uniquely, miraculously rich in the one element they needed to survive. So they came, not as explorers, not as conquerors in the way we would understand. They came as miners. Earth wasn't a new home. It was a resource extraction colony, a remote, difficult, but necessary outpost at the edge of their cosmic empire. They established their first base, Eridu, in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia. They set up their operations, their gold processing plants, their landing strips. The leaders of this expedition were figures of immense power, Two half-brothers whose rivalry would shape the destiny of our entire planet. Enlil, the stern commander of the mission, and Enki, the brilliant, empathetic chief scientist and geneticist. They brought with them a legion of their own kind, the worker gods, the Igigi, to toil in the mines of southern Africa. For millennia, the project proceeded as planned. Shipments of gold were ferried back to Nibiru. The homeworld was slowly stabilizing, but here on Earth, conditions were brutal. The labour was backbreaking, relentless, and unforgiving, and the Igigi, the Anunnaki, rank and file, began to suffer. They were not slaves, but they were labourers caught in a seemingly endless cosmic project, far from home. Discontent simmered, it boiled over, and then it exploded into open rebellion. The texts describe it vividly. The Igigi burned their tools. They surrounded Enlil's command centre, their anger a palpable threat. The mission, the survival of their entire species, was suddenly in jeopardy. They couldn't force the workers back into the mines, and they couldn't abandon the mission. The Anunnaki Leadership Council was at an impasse, a crisis that threatened to undo everything. And this is the moment, the precise critical juncture where the story of their species becomes the story of ours. Because it was Enki, the brilliant scientist, who stepped into the panicked silence and proposed a solution so audacious, so controversial, it would change the very definition of life on this planet forever. He would not force the Igigi back to work. He would create a new worker, a substitute. He would take the primitive, upright hominid already evolving on this world, the creature we would likely identify as Homo erectus, and he would upgrade it. He would manipulate its genetic code, infuse it with a portion of the Anunnaki's own essence, and fashion a new being, a primitive worker, the Lulu Amelu, US. Picture the scene described in the Atrahasis, one of the oldest creation epics. This isn't a story of a god breathing life into clay in a magical garden. It reads like a lab report. Enki, along with the chief medical officer Ninti, discusses the procedure. They need the essence of a god, the genetic material, to be mixed with the clay of the earth, the DNA of the native hominid. They speak of purification, of a process of binding the two together. They describe the use of Anunnaki females as surrogate mothers to carry the first generations of these new beings to term. The texts even record their failures. The first attempts produced creatures that were deformed, non-viable, sterile. It was a process of trial and error, of tweaking a biological code until they got it right. Think about that. Our own creation story, as told by our creators, is a story of research and development. We were not a divine creation born of love. We were a product, engineered to solve a labour dispute. Our purpose was not to contemplate the cosmos, to create art, or to build civilizations. Our purpose was to hold a pickaxe. We were designed with specific parameters, a deliberately shortened lifespan, so we would not live long enough to accumulate dangerous knowledge. An initial inability to procreate on our own, so our numbers could be strictly controlled, and a deep, ingrained reverence for our creators, coded into our very being. We looked upon the Anunnaki and saw gods not because we were primitive, but because we were literally designed to see them that way. For a time, the experiment was a staggering success. The Lulu and Melu were strong, docile, and they worked tirelessly in the mines and fields, freeing the Anunnaki to manage the grander operation. The gold shipments resumed. The crisis was averted, but a fundamental schism had formed between the two Anunnaki leaders. Enlil, the commander, had always been wary of this new species. He saw us as an abomination, a dangerous precedent. He viewed us as tools, and tools should never be allowed to develop a will of their own. Enki, on the other hand, felt a paternal connection to his creation. He saw the flicker of consciousness in our eyes, the potential that he himself had woven into our DNA. He was proud of us, and it was this conflict, this philosophical war between the pragmatic commander and the compassionate scientist, that would lead to the next critical event in our development. It was Enki who, in secret and against Enlil's direct orders, made a second genetic alteration. He gave us the ability to reproduce. This changed everything. We were no longer a controllable, sterile workforce. We were now a true species capable of exponential growth. We began to multiply across the face of the earth, our numbers swelling from thousands to millions. And Enlil was furious. His worst fears were being realized. The experiment was running wild. The tools were taking over the workshop. He saw our burgeoning population not as a miracle, but as an infestation that needed to be wiped out. This brings us to one of the most universal myths in all of human culture, the Great Flood. Nearly every ancient civilization has a story of a world-destroying deluge sent by angry gods to punish mankind. We're told it was for our wickedness, our sin. But what if that was just a justification layered on top of a much more practical decision? What if the flood wasn't a punishment, but a termination protocol? The Sumerian texts, which predate the biblical account of Noah by millennia, tell a very different story. They describe Enlil, infuriated by the noise of humanity, our teeming, chaotic cities, convening the Anunnaki Council and forcing a vote. The decision was made to let the next passage of Nibiru through the inner solar system, with its immense gravitational pull, trigger a catastrophic polar ice melt. This would create a tidal wave that would scour the Earth clean. The Anunnaki would retreat to their orbiting craft and simply wait for the planet to be sterilized of their failed experiment. They took an oath of secrecy to let humanity perish without warning, but Enki could not stand by and watch his children be annihilated. Defying the council, he went to the dwelling of his human favourite, a man named Utnapishtim, the blueprint for the biblical Noah. He didn't speak to him directly, to avoid breaking the letter of his oath. Instead, he spoke to the reed wall of the hut, knowing the man was inside. He whispered the secret of the coming cataclysm and gave him precise technical instructions to build a submersible vessel, a magurga, to preserve the seed of man and beast. The flood came, just as Enlil had planned, a terrifying wall of water that swept away everything. The text described the other Anunnaki watching from orbit, weeping at the destruction of their creation. When the waters receded and Enlil saw Utnapishtim's boat, his rage was immense. But Enki confessed, arguing that humanity, flawed as it was, deserved to exist. A new pact was forged. Humanity would be allowed to survive, but under new terms. The experiment would continue, but it would be managed differently. This is the world after the flood, roughly 11,000 BCE. The slate has been wiped almost clean, but the core problem, from Enlil's perspective, remains. Humanity is still fertile, still chaotic, still capable of independent thought. A new strategy was needed, and this new strategy is what leads us directly to the great abandonment of 4000 BCE. The Anunnaki decided to shift from direct oversight to indirect rule. Instead of managing us like cattle, they would teach us to build our own pens. They chose a specific region, Sumer, and gave humanity the gifts of civilization, but they didn't give them to everyone. They established a new social order, a pyramid of power with themselves at the very top. Below them, they created a new class of human, the demigods, the god kings. These were rulers infused with Anunnaki lineage, intermediaries who could carry out the will of the gods on earth. This is the origin of the concept of the divine right of kings. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a biological reality. They gave these new rulers the blueprints for society. They taught them agriculture, not just how to plant seeds, but the complex science of irrigation and crop rotation. They taught them architecture, how to build ziggurats that were not just temples, but command and control centres, celestial observatories. They gave them written language, cuneiform, a tool for keeping records, for managing grain supplies, for codifying laws. They gave them a complex understanding of astronomy, not for spiritual wonder, but for practical purposes. To track the 3,600-year cycle of Nibiru, to know when their masters would return. Everything they gave us had a purpose tied to their own needs. A stable agricultural society created reliable surpluses. A managed kingdom was easier to control than scattered tribes. A population that could read and write could receive and follow complex instructions. They were, in effect, automating their own resource extraction project. They were teaching the AI to run its own data center. For several millennia, this new model worked. Cities like Uruk, Ur, and Eridu flourished under the direct, visible rule of the Anunnaki and their appointed kings. The gold and resource shipments continued. Humanity was now a self-regulating, productive asset. And this brings us to the core of our question. What happened around 4000 BCE, or more accurately, in the period leading up to it? The evidence in the texts and in the archaeological record suggests a gradual but deliberate withdrawal. The gods became more remote, their appearances less frequent, and then they were gone. Why? Let's consider the possibilities, moving from the most pragmatic to the most profound. The first and simplest explanation is that the mission was over. After hundreds of thousands of years of toil, they had mined enough gold. Nibiru's atmosphere was shielded, their homeworld saved. There was simply no longer any reason to maintain a massive, expensive, and often troublesome operation on this remote planet. It was a purely logistical decision. They packed up their essential equipment, promoted their local managers to full autonomy, and went home. In this scenario, we weren't a failure at all. We were a resounding success. We were the tool that did its job so well, it was no longer needed. They left us with the keys to the kingdom, the foundational software of civilization, and simply moved on. This is a clean, logical explanation. It fits many of the facts, but it feels incomplete. It doesn't account for the deep vein of conflict and chaos that runs through the Anunnaki story. Which brings us to the second possibility. The project had not ended. It had just become too dangerous for them to manage directly. Remember the rivalry between Enlil and Enki? This wasn't a simple disagreement. It was a fundamental clash of ideologies that trickled down through their lineages, causing constant strife. The texts are filled with stories of the Anunnaki gods battling each other, using human armies as their pawns. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the stories of Inanna's conquests, the tale of the Tower of Babel, these can be read as accounts of civil wars among our creators. The Tower of Babel story is particularly revealing. Enlil, seeing humanity united in a single massive project, building a spaceport, Hashem, fears their power. He doesn't destroy them. He confuses their tongues. He scatters them. He breaks them into competing factions to ensure they can never again unite and challenge the gods. What if, by 4000 BCE, these internal conflicts had reached a breaking point? What if the Earth project was becoming a liability, a bloody chessboard that was consuming too many resources and causing too much instability. Perhaps the decision to leave was a treaty, a mutual agreement to withdraw all forces, abandon the colony, and leave humanity to its own devices, effectively quarantining the planet to prevent our conflicts from escalating and spilling out into their larger cosmic society. They didn't abandon us because we failed. They abandoned us because they were failing. Their own internal chaos was mirrored in their creation, and they had to sever the connection to save themselves. This explains the constant, inexplicable warfare that has defined human history ever since. We are not an inherently violent species. We are a species imprinted with the conflicts of our creators, left to play out their ancient rivalries with no understanding of the original stakes. We fight over borders, religions, and resources, but perhaps we are just acting out the echoes of the war between Enlil and Enki. But there is a third possibility, one that is far more disturbing, and one that aligns most closely with the title of this exploration. What if we were, in fact, a failed experiment? But our failure wasn't that we were too stupid or too weak. Our failure was that we became too much like them. Enki didn't just give us the ability to reproduce. He wove into our genetic code the very essence of the Anunnaki: ambition, passion, creativity, self-awareness, the capacity for love, and the capacity for hatred. He saw these as gifts, but Enlil saw them as fatal flaws in a tool. A hammer does not need to question why it strikes the nail. A worker drone does not need to dream of a better life. We were designed for the mines, but we started looking at the stars. The Anunnaki are described as beings of immense intellect, but also of immense ego. They were prone to jealousy, rage, and political scheming, and they saw these same traits emerging with terrifying speed in their creation. We were learning too fast. We were adapting too well. Gilgamesh, the Sumerian king who was 2/3 god, goes on a quest not for power or wealth, but for immortality. He directly challenges the one thing that separates man from God. He seeks to erase the final limitation they placed upon us, and perhaps this was the final straw. The Anunnaki looked at us and saw a distorted, accelerated reflection of themselves. A species with their ambition, but without their lifespan to temper it. A species with their capacity for conflict, but with a terrifying reproductive rate. They had created a biological fire, and it was threatening to burn down the whole house. They realized they had lost control. They couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. The decision to leave in this context was not logistical or political. It was an act of self-preservation. It was a quarantine. They cut their losses and abandoned the laboratory before the experiment could break out and contaminate, or even one day supplant its creators. They left us here on this isolated planet, trapped by gravity and our own short lifespans, to see what would happen. Would we destroy ourselves with the flawed code they had given us? Or would we, against all odds, transcend our violent origins? Perhaps our entire history, these last 6,000 years, is the unattended outcome of that abandoned experiment. What evidence did they leave behind? The clues are everywhere, hiding in plain sight. They are in the impossible knowledge of ancient peoples. The Dogon tribe of Africa, who possessed advanced astronomical knowledge of the Sirius star system. Knowledge they claimed was given to them by amphibious sky beings that modern science only confirmed in the 20th century. How is this possible? The evidences are in our very genes, the so-called junk DNA that makes up over 95% of our genome. For decades, science dismissed it as evolutionary detritus. But what if it isn't junk at all? What if it's a deactivated code? latent functions and abilities that were deliberately switched off before our creators left? Are we running on a fraction of our true potential, a kind of biological safe mode? The startling leap in brain size from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens is a puzzle that still baffles paleontologists. It happened too quickly, defying the normal gradual pace of evolution. It looks less like evolution and more like an intervention. The evidence is in the megalithic structures scattered across the globe, from the pyramids of Giza to Pumapunku in Bolivia, structures built with a precision that baffles modern engineering, quarrying and lifting stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons. We are told these were built with copper chisels and brute force. But what if they were built with the tools and technologies of the gods, left behind as functioning infrastructure before their departure? And perhaps most profoundly, the evidence is in our shared psychology, that persistent, nagging feeling that we are not from here, that sense of cosmic loneliness, our relentless, almost irrational drive to explore space, to return to the stars. Is this our own ambition, or is it a deeply ingrained homing instinct, a memory encoded in our very soul of the place from which our creators came? Our religions, our myths of gods who promise to one day return, are these just wishful thinking, or are they a garbled but accurate memory of a promise that was made? So where does that leave us? We live in a world of staggering technological achievement. We split the atom, we walk on the moon, we map the human genome. We see ourselves as the pinnacle of evolution, the masters of this planet. But what if we are just the children of a dysfunctional, long-gone family? Children left alone in a very big house, playing with matches and slowly deciphering the notes our parents left behind. The timeline is what is so staggering. They departed roughly 6,000 years ago. One orbit of Nibiru is 3,600 years. By that math, they have passed by only once since they left us to our own devices. Perhaps they swung by, took a long-range look at our progress, our wars, our empires, our religions, our fledgling science, and decided to keep their distance, to let the experiment continue to run its course. What will they see on the next pass? Will they see a species that has overcome its violent programming? A species that has united, that has understood its own cosmic origins, that is ready to rejoin the galactic community? Or will they see a planet still racked by petty conflicts, a species still enslaved by the echoes of their creators' rivalries, a failed experiment spiraling towards self-destruction? The question of why they abandoned us may be the most important question we can ask about our own past. But the question of what we do with that abandonment is the most important question we can ask about our future. Our creators are gone. The training wheels are off. Whatever we become now is up to us. Are we merely the sum of our programming, destined to repeat the mistakes of the gods who made us? Or can we become something more? Something they never intended. Something they might even fear. The records are there, carved in stone and clay, waiting for us to read them, not as poetry, but as history. The legacy is in our blood, in the very fabric of our DNA. The great experiment isn't over. We are living it, and the final results have yet to be written. Think about the sheer, brutal impossibility of what our ancestors achieved. We are shown images of Egyptians moving massive stones on wooden rollers, of Incans fitting blocks with simple bronze tools. We accept these explanations because they are comfortable. They fit a neat, linear progression of history, but they are profoundly, demonstrably wrong. They are a fairy tale we tell ourselves to avoid a much more unsettling reality. Let's travel to the high plains of Bolivia to a site that shatters this fairy tale completely, Pumapunku. It lies in ruins, a chaotic jumble of impossibly engineered blocks. These are not simple bricks, these are H-shaped blocks, intricately carved with laser-like precision and designed to interlock perfectly. The stone itself is diorite and andesite, materials so hard they rank just below diamond on the Mohs scale. You cannot shape diorite with a copper chisel, you can barely scratch it. Modern engineers, when confronted with Pumapunku, are baffled. The precision grooves, some less than a millimetre wide, run perfectly straight for metres. The drill holes are flawlessly cylindrical, with no trace of the wobble you would get from a hand-cranked tool. The only way we could replicate this today is with diamond-tipped computer-guided machinery. Yet these ruins are officially dated to a time when the local culture supposedly lacked even a written language, let alone electricity or advanced metallurgy. Does that make any sense to you? Or is it more logical to see Pumapunku for what it looks like? The remnants of a prefabricated structure. A complex modular building kit, manufactured with industrial precision and assembled on site. It doesn't look like a temple built by primitives. It looks like a high-tech facility that was violently blown apart. Perhaps in one of the very Anunnaki civil wars the text describes so vividly. Now let's move to Baalbek in Lebanon. Here the Roman temple complex is built on top of a platform of stone blocks that dwarf anything the Romans themselves ever built. The foundation contains 3 blocks known as the trilithon, each weighing an estimated 800 tons. For perspective, our largest modern mobile cranes struggle to lift 200 tons. And underneath this platform, in a nearby quarry, lies a 4th block, the stone of the pregnant woman, and its even larger companion, the stone of the south. These weigh over 1,200 and 1,650 tons respectively. They are the largest worked monoliths on the face of the planet. The official explanation is that these were quarried and moved by unknown means for a temple that was never finished. But what if the platform wasn't a temple foundation? What if it was a landing pad, a launch platform, the kind of massively reinforced structure you would need to support the takeoff and landing of colossal spacecraft, whose engine thrust would pulverize anything less substantial? The Anunnaki texts repeatedly refer to these places as the landing place. They don't call them temples, we do. These sites are not anomalies, they are data points. They are the decaying infrastructure of a global operation run by beings with technology far beyond our own. The Anunnaki weren't just mining gold, they were building a world. And when they left, they simply walked away from their construction sites, leaving the heavy machinery and the foundations behind for their bewildered former workforce to puzzle over. The knowledge they left behind was just as impossible as the structures. Consider the Sumerian understanding of the cosmos. On cylinder seal VA/243, housed in a Berlin museum, is a clear depiction of our solar system. It shows the sun at the centre, with all the planets we know of today orbiting it, including Pluto. But it also shows them in their correct relative sizes and positions. And it shows one more planet, the massive Nibiru, passing between Mars and Jupiter. How did they know this? They had no telescopes. Uranus was not discovered by modern science until 1781, Neptune in 1846, Pluto in 1930. Yet the Sumerians knew about all of them 6,000 years ago. They described Uranus and Neptune as blue-green watery twins, a perfect description we could only confirm when Voyager 2 flew past them in the late 1980s. The Sumerians didn't discover this. They were told it. It was basic, elementary knowledge to them, like a child today learning the planets in school. It was the map of their creator's home neighbourhood. This pattern repeats itself across the world, knowledge that is wildly out of time and out of place. The infamous Antikythera mechanism, a complex astronomical clock recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck, contained a sophisticated system of bronze gears that could predict eclipses and chart planetary motions. Its complexity was unmatched for over 1,000 years. Was it a Roman invention, or a salvaged, poorly understood piece of Anunnaki equipment, a leftover navigation device? What about the so-called Baghdad battery? A simple clay pot containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, which when filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar, produces an electric current. It's dismissed as a device for electroplating jewellery, but why is there no electroplated jewellery from that period? What if it's the most primitive, cargo cult attempt to replicate the power sources of the gods? The MEs mentioned in the texts, described as small powerful objects that contained all the data for civilization, sound less like tablets of destiny and more like solid-state hard drives. The Ark of the Covenant, as described in the book of Exodus, with its specific construction of wood and gold, sounds terrifyingly like an electrical capacitor, a power box so dangerous it would kill anyone who touched it improperly. We look at these artifacts as isolated mysteries, but what if they are all part of the same story? They are the fading technological echoes of our former masters. We were the local workforce who watched the technicians leave, and then spent the next few millennia trying to get the abandoned machines to work again, eventually turning the instruction manuals into holy books, and the diagnostic readouts into prophecies. The most profound evidence, however, isn't in stone or metal, it's in us. It's in our blood and in our bones. Our own genetic code tells the same story as the clay tablets, if we are brave enough to read it. Let's look at human chromosome 2. You see, all other great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, have 24 pairs of chromosomes. Humans have only 23. For a long time, this was a major puzzle. Where did the missing pair go? The answer is astounding. Our chromosome 2 is actually 2 ancestral ape chromosomes fused together, end to end. The evidence is undeniable. We can see the telomeres, the caps that should be at the ends of a chromosome, fused together in the middle. We can even see a deactivated second centromere from the original chromosome. This is not a natural mutation. The odds of such a fusion happening spontaneously and then propagating through an entire species are astronomically low. It is, however, exactly what a genetic engineer would do. It's a clean, efficient way to restructure a genome. It is a smoking gun. It is the visible scar of the moment Enki took the raw material of a primitive hominid and rebuilt it into something new, something in his own image. And what about that baffling explosion in brain size? The cranial capacity of Homo erectus was around 900 cubic centimetres. Over 1 million years, it barely changed. Then suddenly, with the appearance of Homo sapiens, it jumps to an average of 1,400 cubic centimetres. This is evolution on hyperspeed. It makes no sense from a purely natural selection standpoint. A larger brain consumes a massive amount of energy, making it a liability unless it provides an immediate, overwhelming survival advantage. But it makes perfect sense if it was an artificial upgrade. Enki didn't need a creature that was just strong. He needed a creature that could understand complex instructions, that could learn, adapt, and problem solve. He needed to upgrade the processor. So he did. He injected a massive block of new genetic information, perhaps from his own Anunnaki genome, and in doing so, created us. But with this upgrade came unforeseen consequences. With that higher processing power came self-awareness, existential dread, ambition, and the ability to question. We were given the hardware to run the mining software, but we started writing our own programs. Think about the sheer number of genetic disorders unique to humans. Thousands of them. Far more than any other species on the planet. Why are we so fragile, so prone to breakdown? Perhaps it's because our code was hastily written. It was a rush job, a patch designed to solve a crisis. It works, but it's full of bugs, remnants of the splicing and editing process that were never fully smoothed out. We are, in a very real sense, a brilliant but unstable piece of biological technology. The Anunnaki didn't just alter our destiny, they became our destiny, written into our very cells. And this brings us to the control systems they put in place to manage their creation. The primary system was simple and brutally effective: kingship. When the tablets speak of kingship being lowered from heaven, they are being literal. After the flood, the Anunnaki realized direct rule was inefficient. They needed local managers, so they created a hybrid ruling class. They took human females and had children with them. The resulting offspring, the demigods like Gilgamesh, were stronger, lived longer, and were smarter than ordinary humans. They were the perfect intermediaries. They could command the loyalty of the human population, but their own loyalty was to their Anunnaki fathers. This is the real origin of the blue-blooded royals, the divine right of kings. It wasn't a political theory, it was a breeding program. And we have the records. The Sumerian king list is one of the most enigmatic documents ever found. It lists rulers of Sumer and their reigns. Before the flood, the kings have reigns that last for tens of thousands of years. For example, Alulim, the first king of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. After the flood, the reigns become dramatically shorter, but still unnaturally long. Gilgamesh himself is listed with a reign of 126 years. Mainstream historians dismiss the pre-flood list as myth, but what if it's not? What if those first kings with the impossibly long reigns were the Anunnaki themselves? Enki, for instance, ruling his city of Eridu directly, and the post-flood kings with the merely superhuman lifespans? Those were the hybrid demigods. With each successive generation, their Anunnaki bloodline diluted, their connection to the gods weakened, and their lifespans shortened until they became indistinguishable from ordinary humans. The king list isn't a myth, it's a genetic ledger. It tracks the decay of the divine bloodline over time. Alongside this biological control, they instituted a software control, organized religion. The temple in a Sumerian city wasn't just a place for prayer, it was the command center. It was the administrative building, the resource silo, the scientific observatory, and the bank. The priests weren't mystics, they were educated technocrats. They were the ones trained by the Anunnaki to read the stars, to manage the granaries, to interpret the will of the gods, which was simply the operational plan for the entire city-state enterprise. The elaborate rituals, the sacrifices, the festivals, these were methods of ensuring public compliance. They were a user-friendly interface for a population that couldn't understand the complex underlying systems of agriculture, astronomy, and social engineering that were actually running their lives. They were told a god demanded a certain portion of their grain. In reality, that grain was going into a centralized silo for resource management and redistribution, a system designed for maximum efficiency. We call it religion. The Anunnaki likely called it project management. So what happened when this complex system of control was suddenly left headless? Imagine a highly advanced corporation with branches all over the world. It has a clear command structure, from the CEO down to the local managers. Now imagine that one day, the entire corporate headquarters, the CEO, the board, the top executives, simply vanishes. They stop answering calls, they stop sending directives. What happens to the local branches? Chaos. That is what happened on Earth after 4000 BCE, a sudden, terrifying power vacuum. The local managers, the human kings who had always ruled with the direct authority of a present god, were suddenly on their own. Their source of power, knowledge, and legitimacy was gone. And so they did what humans do. They fought. The subsequent history of the Near East is a story of that power vacuum being filled. The Akkadian Empire, led by Sargon the Great, rises up and conquers the Sumerian city-states. Sargon is the first great empire builder, but what was he really doing? He was trying to replicate the unified global control system the Anunnaki had established. He was trying to be the new Enlil. His successors did the same. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, each empire was an attempt to rebuild the pyramid of power, but this time with a human at the top. The kings who followed still claimed divine right, but it was a lie. They were no longer hybrids, they were just men. They had to create elaborate mythologies and propaganda to justify their rule, to convince the populace that they still spoke for the gods who were now so conspicuously silent. And this is where the knowledge began to decay. The precise astronomical and agricultural science of the Sumerians was slowly corrupted. Astronomy, the practical science of tracking celestial bodies for agriculture and for monitoring Nibiru's return, devolved into astrology, a superstitious system of fortune-telling. The complex chemical knowledge, possibly related to metallurgy and medicine, became alchemy, a mystical quest for gold and eternal life. The historical records, the detailed accounts of the Anunnaki's arrival and actions, were edited, embellished, and transformed into mythological epics. The technical manuals became morality plays. We didn't just lose our leaders, we lost the instruction manual for our own civilization. We were left with all this advanced hardware, agriculture, metallurgy, mathematics, writing, but we had lost the theoretical understanding of why it worked. We became a species defined by a kind of technological amnesia, desperately trying to reverse engineer our own past. This may also explain the strange case of the Tower of Babel. The biblical story tells us humanity, united with one language, tried to build a tower to reach the heavens, and an angry God scattered them and confused their languages. But the original Sumerian accounts speak of Enlil, alarmed at a human project to build a Shem, a rocket, a spaceport in Babylon. He saw it as a direct challenge. His response was not to flood them again, but to introduce social chaos. He broke them apart. What if the abandonment wasn't a single event, but a process, a gradual withdrawal, followed by a final decisive act of sabotage to ensure their fledgling creation could never follow them? They didn't just leave, they pulled the ladder up behind them. They scrambled our communications, they pitted us against each other, and they erased the star maps. They locked us in the nursery. So we were left here, a species fractured into warring tribes and nations, each one clinging to a different, distorted memory of the same creators. Each religion claiming it had the one true connection to the now absent gods. Is it any wonder our history is a relentless saga of warfare? We are fighting over a memory. We are fighting over whose distorted echo of the truth is the correct one. The war between Enlil and Enki, between control and freedom, between pragmatism and empathy, never ended. It simply became internalized within the human species. It is the conflict that rages within our own civilizations and within each of us. The implications of this are almost too vast to hold in your mind at once. It reframes everything we think we know about ourselves. That persistent feeling of spiritual longing, that search for meaning, that ache for a connection to something greater. Is this a natural human trait, or is it the programmed dependency of a servant species longing for the return of its master? Is our relentless drive for progress and expansion our own ambition, or are we simply running the last command they gave us, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth? We are a paradox, a species capable of composing symphonies and calculating the movements of galaxies, yet also capable of unimaginable brutality and self-destruction. We are simultaneously brilliant and insane, and this paradox makes perfect sense if we are a hybrid creation, a creature with the mind of a god trapped in the biology of a modified animal, forever caught between the starlight of our origins and the mud of our engineered evolution. Perhaps the greatest question is not whether they will return, but what they will think of us when they do. If they do swing by on their next 3,600-year pass, what will they find? Will they see that their abandoned project has finally achieved a stable, enlightened state? Or will they find a planet still scarred by warfare, teetering on the brink of environmental collapse, its inhabitants still hopelessly trapped in the ancient conflicts they were programmed with? Would they see us as a success, a species that, despite its flawed origins, reached for the stars on its own? Or would they see us as the ultimate liability, a rogue experiment that has grown far too powerful and must finally be decommissioned before it poses a threat to its creators? The truth is, we don't know. We are the subjects of an experiment, and we have never been allowed to read the lab notes. All we can do is study the evidence left behind and try to piece together the terrifying, magnificent, and deeply humbling story of what we are and why we are here. The choice of what we do next, of which part of our inherited nature we choose to embrace, is the only thing that is truly ours. Let us dig deeper into that programming. The religious and moral frameworks they left us with are perhaps the most sophisticated and enduring control system ever devised. Think about the core concepts, the idea of original sin. What is it really? We are told it is a primordial stain on the human soul, a moral failing inherited from our first ancestors. But what if it's a technical description? What if sin is simply the Anunnaki word for our inherent flaw, the spark of self-aware disobedience that Enki gifted us, the tendency for the tool to question its purpose? Original sin is the memory of our own upgrade, framed as a crime by the faction that opposed it. And what of faith? The command to believe without question. For a species designed to follow orders, this makes perfect sense. Faith is the bypass code for critical thought. It ensures the smooth operation of the system. You don't need to understand celestial mechanics to plant your crops on the day the priests tell you to. You just need to believe that the gods demand it. It is the ultimate form of social cohesion for a workforce that must be kept in the dark about the true nature of the enterprise. Even the concept of an afterlife, of heaven and eternal reward, can be seen through this lens. The Anunnaki lived for what seemed like an eternity to early humans. Their lifespans covered hundreds of thousands of our years. They possessed medical technology that could heal catastrophic wounds, perhaps even revive those who were recently deceased. What would that look like to a primitive human? It would look like resurrection. It would look like divinity. The promise of an afterlife wasn't a spiritual comfort. It was a management tool, a promise of a future reward for present-day compliance. It was the ultimate carrot to keep the workforce focused and docile. The story of Ardapa, a human sage created by Enki, illustrates this perfectly. Ardapa is so brilliant, he is summoned to the heavenly abode of Anu, the Anunnaki king. Enki, his creator, warns him not to eat or drink anything he is offered there, telling him it will be the food and water of death. But when Ardapa arrives, Anu is so impressed with him, he offers him the bread and water of life, which would grant him immortality. Remembering Enki's warning, Ardapa refuses. He returns to Earth, having forfeited his chance to become like the gods. Anu looks down and laments the flawed mortal creature. Why would Enki, his protector, deceive him? Because Enlil's faction had won the argument. The decision had been made. Humanity must remain mortal, limited, contained. Enki was forced to ensure his own creation was kept from its final upgrade. Ardapa's story is the tragic record of a corporate policy decision, a deliberate limiting of our potential, passed down to us as a parable about the dangers of hubris. Now we must zoom out, because this grand, tragic experiment was not confined to the dust of Mesopotamia. That was merely the headquarters, the command and control centre, but this was a global operation, and to see that, we must turn our eyes to the Black Land, the kingdom of the Nile, to ancient Egypt. The parallels are staggering, and they are not a coincidence. The Egyptian pantheon reads like a caste list from another branch of the same Anunnaki corporation. Their chief solar deity, Ra, shares all the characteristics of Anu, the distant king, and the god of wisdom, magic and writing, the one who brought knowledge to mankind. Thoth. The Egyptians depicted him as ibis-headed, but his function is identical to that of Enki, and it's no accident. According to some texts, Thoth was in fact Ningishida, a son of Enki, who was assigned dominion over the African territories, including the Nile Valley. Suddenly, Egyptian civilization makes sense in this context. It wasn't an isolated miracle. It was the Egyptian franchise of the Anunnaki Earth Project. They had different managers, a different regional culture, but they used the same core operating system. Divine kingship. The pharaoh was the living incarnation of the god Horus, a direct descendant of the gods. Monumental architecture that defies our understanding. The Great Pyramid of Giza is not a tomb, it is a machine of impossible scale and precision, aligned to the cardinal points with an accuracy we can barely match today. Its internal shafts point to specific stars, not for religious reasons, but like an antenna array locked onto a signal. The pyramids, like the ziggurats, were multifunctional infrastructure, but the Egyptian obsession was different from the Sumerian one. They were fixated on preservation, on the afterlife, on immortality. Why? Perhaps because their specific ruler, Thoth Enki's son, was part of the scientific faction that believed humanity deserved more. The elaborate mummification process, the intricate spells of the Book of the Dead, the vast tomb complexes, was this all just superstition? Or was it a cargo cult? A desperate, flawed attempt by the Egyptians to replicate the Anunnaki's own life-extending technology after they had departed. They saw their gods overcome death, and they spent the next 3,000 years trying to reverse engineer the process with linen wraps and salt. And the operation was wider still. We have to cross the ocean to a continent that was supposedly isolated from this entire world, to the Americas. And there, what do we find? The exact same story, told with different names. In Mesoamerica, the central god of creation is Quetzalcoatl, or Kukulkan to the Maya. And who was he? A tall, light-skinned, bearded god who came from the sky. He brought the knowledge of agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and architecture. He forbade human sacrifice. He ruled for a time, and then he departed, sailing east across the ocean on a raft of snakes, promising one day to return. It is the same pattern: a civilizing god, an Anunnaki project manager, setting up an operation, teaching a local workforce, and then, for reasons unknown to the people he left behind, he vanishes. The pyramids of Teotihuacan, the impossible stonework of the Inca, the Mayan calendar with its mind-boggling precision, tracking astronomical cycles over millions of years, these are not the work of isolated Stone Age cultures. They are the fingerprints of the same global technological civilization. What we are seeing is not a single monolithic Anunnaki presence. We are looking at competing corporate divisions, competing family factions, staking out territory on a new world. The Enlil clan controlled the primary mining and shipping operations in the Middle East. The Enki clan, more focused on science and genetics, ran the projects in Africa and, it would seem, the Americas. The differences in their cultures, the militarism of the Assyrians versus the spiritual science of the Egyptians, reflect the personalities of their divine rulers, and like any competing corporate giants, they fought. The wars of the gods described in texts from the Hindu Vedas to the Greek myths were not allegories. They were territorial disputes. They were proxy wars, fought with human soldiers over resources, territory, and influence. We were the pawns in a cosmic game of risk played by our creators. To understand the sheer intensity of this conflict, we need only look at the story of Inanna, or Ishtar, as the Akkadians called her. She was Enlil's granddaughter, the goddess of love and war, a figure of immense ambition and power. One of the most famous Sumerian poems details her descent into the underworld, the domain of her sister, Ereshkigal. It is presented as a myth of death and rebirth, but read it as a historical document. Read it as a report of a hostile takeover. Inanna decides to visit her sister's realm. She adorns herself with 7 specific items of power, her MEs, the divine technologies. To enter, she must pass through 7 gates, and at each gate, the gatekeeper forces her to remove 1 item: her crown, her measuring rod, her jewels. By the time she reaches her sister's throne, she is naked and powerless. This is not a ritual. This is a systematic disarmament protocol. This is like a general being forced to surrender her command codes, her sidearm, and her security clearance at a series of checkpoints before entering a rival's headquarters. In the throne room, she is judged by the 7 judges of the underworld, the Anunnaki council of that realm, and condemned. She is killed and her corpse is hung on a hook. This is a political assassination. But Enki, ever the schemer, intervenes. He creates 2 small robotic beings who sneak into the underworld and, using the food and water of life, revive Inanna. She is resurrected. She returns to the upper world, more powerful than ever, accompanied by a host of demons, the Gala. This is not a myth. This is a story of espionage, political intrigue, and advanced technology. It details a power struggle between 2 regional governors. It involves secure facilities with energy-based security systems, a political tribunal, an execution, and a revival using advanced biological agents or nanotechnology. What our ancestors called magic was simply the technology of their creators, and this constant, vicious infighting provides perhaps the most compelling reason for the abandonment. The Earth Project was becoming a cancer. The proxy wars between the gods were escalating. The human armies, now equipped with bronze weapons and organised military tactics taught to them by their creators, were becoming dangerously effective. The Anunnaki leadership, perhaps back on Nibiru or in some orbital command, looked at the situation on Earth and saw a reflection of their own worst tendencies running rampant. The experiment was not just out of control, it was becoming a threat to the stability of their entire cosmic empire. So they made a decision, not just to leave, but to shut it all down. The departure around 4000 BCE was likely a phased withdrawal. They pulled out their key personnel first. They dismantled the most advanced and dangerous technology. They left behind a world stripped of its most dangerous secrets, a civilization grappling with Bronze Age tech, and a legacy of myths that were, in fact, historical records of cosmic intervention. Consider the staggering implications. Our foundational stories, the very fabric of our earliest religions, not divine encounters, but echoes of a technologically superior race, abandoning a volatile, self-destructive experiment. What if the so-called Dark Ages were less about societal collapse and more about the deliberate suppression or removal of dangerous advanced knowledge? This isn't just a retelling of ancient tales, it's a terrifying re-evaluation of our place in the universe. It suggests that our history is not solely our own, but a chapter in a much grander, far more dangerous saga. And the ultimate question remains, if they left because of our escalating proxy wars, our violent tendencies mirroring their own, what have we truly learned since then? Are we still trapped in patterns that once doomed a cosmic empire's grand project? The answers, I suspect, are buried deep within our own collective memory, waiting to be unearthed.